Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to a new session of the TVS colloquia. Today we have the pleasure of having Aman Raju with us. He's a master's student working with quasar variability. So please, Aman, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today, and thanks for the opportunity to present at this colloquia. So I'm going to be presenting the work I've done as part of the QNPy package in order to model quasar variability from light curves, specifically for those that we'd expect to see in the LSST. And I'll talk about the upgrades that we've made with attentive processes and a latent space upgrade to the neural processes in QNPy. So my talk will be structured like this. I'm going to go over a brief description of AGNs and then talk about the variability of quasars and the challenges in modeling them and previous methods used for modeling. Then I'll talk about QNPy and neural process that make up the heart of QNPy. And then I'm going to be talking about the upgrades that I've made to QNPy as part of my master's work with a pre-processing clustering algorithm that has been added and is actually available now. And then upgrades to the modeling in QNPy with attentive mechanisms and the latent space. So as a brief history of AGN, since this talk is for a more general audience, AGN were discovered at different times. So there were a few different names for them earlier. So initially, the first ones were discovered by Carl Seifert when he was analyzing the spectra of certain galaxies, and he saw characteristic broad absorption lines and also the presence of forbidden lines in them. And we also saw another phenomena within radio, where we saw very luminous extended objects in the radio, but when we actually looked at their optical signal, they were very point-like, like a star, and they had characteristic spectra, unlike galaxies, which have more flatter spectra. So eventually, through more study and more theory, there now is a more agreed upon unified model of AGNs, where these processes are all thought to come from the same fundamental object that is at the heart of distant galaxies. So the AGN works as such. There is a supermassive black hole, which is at the center of the host galaxy of the AGN. And around this supermassive black hole, there's an accretion disk, which contains matter in it. The matter that starts falling into the black hole heats up this accretion disk to very high energies, and this luminosity given off by this accretion disk is what we see in the form of the signals from AGNs. And there's a few different characteristic regions around AGN, and it's thought, according to the unified model, that depending on the inclination with which the viewer is seeing these AGNs, they see a different type of object. For instance, looking through the narrow line regions, we would see Seyfert type 1 galaxy, Seyfert type 2 galaxies. Looking through the broad line regions, we'd see the more broad lines characteristic of Seyfert 1 galaxies. But we're specifically going to be talking about the study of quasars, which are the ones that have been viewed according to this model at the highest inclinations from the disks. Specifically, quasars have a very high luminosity across different parts of the electromagnetic spectra and can be seen across all wavelengths. And the study of variability of quasars is the best because we're actually studying everything that's going around this object instead of contamination from the host galaxy. So just like quasars emit among a whole range of frequencies, we also see variability occur across frequencies. But the scale of this variability differs depending on the wavelength that you're looking at. At more higher energy X-ray frequencies, this variability can be much more faster. It can be on scales of hours to days. And this is thought to the variability in the X-ray is thought to occur from the atmosphere of the accretion disk around the black hole. And then you have optical or UV variability, which can go on for longer scales, like weeks to months. So in order to actually get a sense of this variability, we need to have dedicated observations that look at a regular cadence at these objects and actually follow up for on the scales of months or maybe even years to get a good picture of the data. And furthermore, unlike a few other objects, the variability in AGN is very stochastic. The signals are all encoded in this layer of red noise, which can mask the presence of any sort of signals within it. Though we can sometimes see periods appear for a few um, cycles within the light curve. These are just mimicked periods coming out of red noise. And when we actually want to study what's going on in them, we would need to actually model and try to find periods from within the data set. So this variability of quasars has been studied, and it's still a subject of ongoing study, but there's a few different theories for what is causing this variability. And some of the sources are from different objects. Number one, you have disk instabilities around in the accretion disk around the supermassive black hole, where overdense regions the thermal instabilities could cause flares within the luminosity of the quasar. And you could also see dips in brightness according to different regions of this supermassive black hole accretion disk. Then you have other sources of variability that could come not from the quasar itself, but from other phenomena occurring around it. You could have microlensing of stars, which causes amplification of the quasar image, which causes a flare within the light curve. And then you have other proposed explanations of activity within the AGN regions, which could be due to a large number of stars undergoing transient phenomena such as supernovae, which could also cause different variable phenomena to occur within the light curve. And the good thing about these three specific explanations for the variability is that there are tests to see which of these is more likely to be causing the variability. And modeling would help us understand where exactly this variability is coming from. But modeling also has more applications on when you actually model. So with AGN, we have a technique called reverberation mapping, where we actually look at the time lag of signals that are coming from around the supermassive black hole, which can help us identify the morphology of the region, as well as perform estimations of the actual mass of the supermassive black hole. And if we actually model well, we can detect hidden periods within the light curves, which can tell us about more phenomena within the AGN region. For instance, we could know if there's actually a binary supermassive black hole occurring within the center of the galaxy. And our team at the Serbian LSST and kind contribution is also working on the QHX package, which is dedicated to finding these hidden periodic frequencies within these signals. We can also look at these model light curves and look if these supermassive binary black holes are there's any indication of a merger about to happen, which is a very exciting problem in astrophysics because we have only one um, confirmed impending merger of supermassive black holes, which I'll talk about later. And we can also look at, especially in a large data set like the LSST, if we can find any new objects or AGN that differ in behavior to something that we've had before, like changing look AGN, where we'd be looking at different inclinations, which could tell us much more about this unified model. And of course, we can look at the sources of variability. So this is why we actually tried to model this variability. And but as I said earlier, this is a very hard problem. So there have been many different attempts at trying to model it. The earliest was trying to simulate a damped random walk to characterize the variability. But this was found to have biases towards shorter timescales of the variability. However, especially over the last decade, there have been many studies that have used many different new deep learning techniques in order to actually encode the stochastic nature of the variability of AGN. There've been many attempts at using autoencoders or versions of neural networks in order to find to generate these signals. And there have also been uses of other algorithms like Gaussian processes or stochastic differential equations, which can model along a large time period. However, when we come to the LSST specifically, there's a few more challenges beyond just the complexity of modeling an AG, quasar light curve. So the LSST has a large data set, as you all know, and specifically for quasars, we expect to see about 10 to 100 million quasars within the LSST database. And since the LSST has the capability to look back much more further into the universe, we'd be seeing quasars that are at higher redshifts and that could have different properties from the quasars that we're used to from previous surveys. And that's why we can't bias our models towards previous data and have estimated parameters when we want to infer new properties about these quasars. And another thing is, as we talked earlier in reverberation mapping, we would want to look at the time lags between different phenomena that is occurring in the light curve. And the LSST has cadences as defined by the observing strategy, which is great in the amount of sky covers. But when we're looking at AGN light curves, we could see large gaps because of these defined cadences so we would need to account for these, and especially when we want to model these time lags in this simulation as done by the study Kovacevic et al. 2022, it was found that the best cadences needed to capture these time lags are shorter cadences on the order of a few days, and modeling will allow us to actually extrapolate from the cadences that we have in the LSST to a nice smooth light curve, which we can actually study more to find out the underlying physical phenomena happening. So to deal with all of these challenges that we have within the LSST as well as modeling the light curves, we have the Q&Pi package, which you can actually check out now. It was developed by our Serbian LSST in-kind contribution software team. And it's available to install with a simple pip install. And you can also check out the GitHub where we have different tutorials and a proper modularized method of how to use this package, where we have pre-processing models to fit your data type with the way the model would work. We have our training of the model, and then we have different ways in which you could generate predictions and make different sorts of visualizations of the processes with it. In our newest update, we've also added the capability to use clustering. So we've made this a multimodal package where you can cluster your light curves before modeling them, which I'm going to talk about later in the presentation. And we have tutorials for this as well. So I'd encourage you to check out the GitHub. And we've been testing it on various different data sets. We have the LSST AGN data challenge, which has been very helpful for our testing. We have Gaia ZTF data, and we're also planning to look at X-ray data with Swift light curves. And we've actually had two publications from the team. The first one with our initial neural processes on assassin light curves, and we found that it worked well. Then we upgraded our packages, included the SOAM for clustering before the processing, and we looked at the LSST AGN data challenge. Specifically in this paper, we focus on one cluster and the results that we have from that. So you can check out these two papers for a nice overview of the neural processes that we've had before. Today, I'm going to be focusing on these upgrades that we've made since these papers. And but first, let me give you a brief summary of what neural processes are. So when you have a problem with many different observations that you want to model, there are classic ways, such as fitting a regression algorithm towards it, which neural networks can do very well. But the problem with neural networks is that they are very, very confident about what they model. They give you one line to fit to your function, and that's it. But For more realistic stochastic data, you'd want some sort of probability distribution over each point so that you know how well each model is representing your data. And models like Gaussian processes do a very good job of actually giving you a distribution of distributions where you can know your probability of your models. But when we want to look at larger data sets and apply these models, we try to use a property called meta-learning, where this model is able to repeatedly learn across different tasks on how to model. So for looking at a large number of quasars, that would mean learning from these different quasars how to actually fit a model to all of them. And that is what meta-learning capabilities would give into a model. And neural processes have all of these three advantages. So they're able to find this distribution of, go over these distribution of points. They're able to give you error associated with your predictions, like Gaussian processes. And they're able to do this meta-learning where they're able to learn from a large data set with just a few number of points from each and learn these representations quickly. They were introduced in this the paper Garnello et al., where you can see where neural processes have come from. And there's a nice repository at Tuba et al. 2020. So here is the working behind neural processes. How they work is you start with your inputs, which in this case would be your observation times and your magnitudes observed or your fluxes observed. And then we pass them through a multi-layer perceptron to encode them into some sort of representation that can be of some certain dimension. Then we take these representations and we have to pool them all together. So the simplest way to do this is just to take a mean pooling and average these representations together. Keep this in mind because we're going to talk about better ways to do this later on. But at the very basic level, we have mean pooling. Then we use this mean pool representation as our global representation of the light curve, and we give this representation to a decoder along with the points, the target points that we actually want to model, which can just be, once again, just a few more points than your context points to see if it's working, or when you actually want to simulate the cadences on the scale of every day, this would be a large number of target points across each of the days that you were observing. And then you would get your model on this. And the great thing about neural processes is that you don't just model the distribution, you also get the likelihood with the mean of the distribution and the standard deviation or the variance of the distribution. And that's how you get your representation. Then the metrics we use to optimize our models for is we mainly look at the log probable loss, which helps us understand how well our distribution is working to the expected distribution. We also have equipped the QNPy with the standard mean squared error and mean absolute error metrics, which can help you understand how well QNPy has worked on the intended data set. So now that you know how it works, let's talk about some of the upgrades that I've been making as part of my master's work. So the first upgrade is using a self-organizing maps to perform clustering of the light curves before we start the actual modeling. So now you might ask yourself, why do we need to cluster the data set? Why can't we just give our input light curves to the models and expect them to model? Well, the first most obvious reason is that we would want quicker algorithms, especially with large data sets like the LSST. So just chopping up the data set into different clusters would increase our speed. But there's also more fundamental reasons that clustering can help our models learn better. When you have a good algorithm, it could be able to look at your input light curves and actually learn something fundamental about them and sort them out into these clusters. So now you get different balanced data sets in each of these clusters, and that can help our models learn better. And we've actually seen this with the implementation of SOMs, where using a self-organizing map actually improved the representations that the models were able to generate on clusters in the LSST AGN data challenge. So here's the algorithm that we're using, self-organizing maps, which have a few benefits that help it well with the neural processes in staying non-parametric. So self-organizing maps are unsupervised algorithms that are easy to update to new data, which make them very helpful for large data sets like the ones we've been talking about. How they work is transforming some sort of high dimensional data like groups of light curves into a 2D representation like this grid, which is our grid of clusters. So a SOM initializes different weights for each of these nodes at the start. Then through each of the training epochs, it chooses its light curve for that epoch, and then it finds the node that's closest to it. We use the Euclidean distance of this light curve from this randomly initialized weight at the starting. We find our best matching unit, which is the node that's closest to that light curve. And then we update the weights of that node as well as other nodes based on this formula, where we add um, we add an update number vector based on this is the learning rate of the node of the SOM, which is a hyperparameter. This is a neighborhood function, which we use the Gaussian for, which is represented by some standard deviation sigma. And of course, the distance between the SOM and that light curve that we're looking at. So since this neighborhood function is here, the SOM nodes have
Aman?
drag.
Yes, I'm sorry. Can you check your microphone because it's a bit off the audio.
Okay, so you can't hear, or there's
I
some sort
can hear, but it's lagging, like a breaking a lot.
um
Maybe
let's
like
see, maybe if I
mute and unmute
stop
again.
and reach. Okay, is it better now?
Not really.
Okay, just 1 minute then.
Yes.
Maybe the video and there is not enough.
Is
Maybe
is it better now?
Now it's a bit better, yes.
Okay.
Aman, could you please come closer to the microphone and be still, not to go, it's okay.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Okay,
Sure.
yes,
Okay.
sorry.
So
Go
that's
ahead.
good. So yes, so this is how we
No, I'm
update the
sorry.
weights of the
I'm sorry to
Okay.
cut you off, but yeah, it's really breaking.
Yeah, I
It
will try
started, but
changing the
it was
data.
better. It was better before. Maybe if you try with your earphones as you were at the beginning, maybe.
Okay, how about now? I changed the network. Is it
Now it's
coming more?
much better. Yes, much
Okay,
better.
that's great. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
So did it cut off when I was showing the SOM, or should I go back a bit?
Yes, there, perfect.
So yeah, it's working now.
Yes, just continue and let's see how it works.
Okay, so this is how we update the weights of the SOM, and as we keep training, we decrease these
I know, I'm so sorry. Maybe cut your video and then you will have more bandwidth. Yeah, sorry
Okay,
about that.
is it better now?
Yes, it's a bit better.
Okay, okay. Okay, so we update our hyperparameters based on the epochs, and SOMs have seen application at many different places before. We've used it on sales data, credit card data, and even in astronomy, you can check this paper for an application on X-ray light curves. So we used our SOM. Yes. So we implemented SOM based on the mini SOM package in Python, which comes with the range of hyperparameters that we've implemented in QNPy here. And we experimented around with these different hyperparameters, as well as adding in a few error metrics to help understand how well the SOM is working on our data. So over here, you see a distribution of the number of clusters that are formed and the number of light curves within each cluster when we train our SOM on with different hyperparameters. And increasing the learning rate and the sigma causes us to have more clusters, and it can also affect how homogeneous these clusters are. Also, the error metrics that we've implemented the quantization error, which tells you how well each of these nodes captures the input data, as well as the topographic error, which tells you how well each best matching unit is to each second best matching unit. And then we have silhouette scores, the silhouette score, the Davy-Boulden index, and the Kalinski-Harabas index, which come from the sklearn package and usually measure over here, these two measure the similarity of light curves within the cluster to the all of the other clusters, while the Kalinski-Harabas index tells you the variance of these light curves to the entire variance. Then we checked these errors on throughout the training of the SOMs, and we found that there are specific hyperparameters that you can tune to get the best result out of your training. So, and then once we did them, here is a graph of the clusters we got from the LSST AGN data challenge, where we looked at all of the light curves that have at least 100 observations within them. And over here, we've sorted out these clusters to basically the number of curves in each of the clusters. And you can see some of them have more characteristic average light curves, here plotted in orange, than others. Some have flares, some have dips, which you can see characteristic of these clusters. And then once we have all of the light curves, which you can see in gray over here, we can actually look if there's some sort of underlying distribution that the SOM has learned from these light curves. So over here, you can see the redshift distribution, their luminosity distributions, their mass distributions, and the variability function, which we've calculated from the light curve. And you can see there are characteristic distributions for each of these clusters. So we can perform analysis of these different properties. And we can look at the structure function, which is thought to correspond to the actual source of variability of the quasar. So now that we have these clusters, we've also tried to implement the capability to do multi-band clustering, where if we train on not just U-band data like we did with the previous clusters, but look at different bands within our surveys, we can see more variance across these clusters instead of more smoother representations. So now that we have our clustering, we can move on to the upgrades that have been made to the modeling process. So the first upgrade is attention. So earlier I said we averaged our light curves to form the mean pooled representation. But the problem with this is that now when you look at your target point, this point more because they're closer rather than something at the ends of the light curves giving the same amount of weight or attention to the target representation. And that's why we have an attentive mechanism which actually does this. You can check out Kim et al., which actually implemented attention for the first time into neural processes. And so here's a bit of a brief description of what attention is. It was initially developed for language learning models, where it was used to actually inform how to predict the different words within a sentence and how much each of them are important to each of these other words in the sentence. So initially for text, what was done was each of these words were encoded into some vector. These vectors were then encoded into some representation using different weights, which correspond to queries, keys, and values, the Q, K, and V matrices. And then what was done is the dot product of these representations from the queries and the keys were taken. Then they were scaled by the dimensionality of the data set so that we have balanced over large dimensional data. Then we take a softmax, which helps convert this into a sort of probability distribution. And then we apply that to the values in order to best understand how well each of these words are working on each of the other parts of the sentence. So you can read the famous Attention is All You Need paper to get a more in-depth understanding of these. But we implemented attention on a time series in a similar way so that it can understand the weights of these different points. And when we did that, here is our, on the left, we have our loss over the different epochs of trainings of our model. And you can see that the blue line where we haven't used attention at some point starts overfitting and the loss actually starts increasing, which is a problem for a model. But when we include attention, first of all, we get much better losses from the very get-go. We train much faster. And also, we still continue getting better and better results with more epochs instead of stabilizing at some point. And you can actually look by eye at our representations, and you can see that light curves that are modeled with attention are actually better than light curves without any attention. We capture the temporal structure of the data much better. So we also did a few more experiments on more complicated models using attention. For instance, we have transformer models, which don't just use one way of the attention as I showed earlier. Instead, we use multi-heads, which means more weights and more capabilities to understand different parts of the time series, along with other capabilities such as positional encoding and masking, which allow transformers to understand the structure of sentences really well. And we've also used them on time series data. You can transformers are most popularly known in their use in ChatGPT, where we have great results on text data. And we wanted to use it for the TikTok signals, which, as I mentioned earlier, are the impending supermassive binary black hole mergers, where we would wanted to see if we could actually catch these signals within the light curves of these quasars. You can check out this paper for an explanation, more in-depth explanation of the TikTok signals and how the first one was categorized. So we used a gated transformer network, which was described in Lee et al. 2021, which was able to look at both steps within the time series as well as the different channels, like the times and the observations and how well they relate to each other. And we looked at TikTok signals, the impending merger signals injected into both toy light curve simulations as well as real LSST AGN data challenge data. And we found very, very high accuracy of these models on both data sets. So this is a very promising model that we're looking into currently in this research. And now I would like to talk about the last upgrade that I've made to QNPy, which is including a latent space into the neural processes model. A latent space is able to capture more information about the inputs by adding an extra channel into this network. Again, we bring back mean pooling because with latent spaces, we want to understand more about the overall structure of the light curve instead of just the effect of each of the points. And then we pass this average representation through a multi-layer perceptron network to generate a latent variable. And so in order to best understand how latent spaces work, it's good to look at a variational autoencoder, which also uses similar features of latent spaces. So a good data set to think of for variational autoencoders is the MNIST data set, which is just drawings of different digits like 0, 1, 2, all the way until 9. So we start with those inputs, and then we encode each of these drawings of numbers into some sort of latent space. So this encoder works could be similar to the encoders we've used before, like multi-layer perceptrons, and we get a mean and standard deviation, which we then use to sample a latent vector from this distribution. So this is very simple. This is just taking the mean and adding some sort of stochastic factor to the standard deviation in order to generate this latent vector. This latent vector is then fed into our decoder, which then reconstructs the input. So we've now decoupled this. Initially over here, we just had the representation. So we encoded the representation and then decoded it back again. But with this latent vector, we can now decouple this decoder and encoder and actually find more fundamental properties about your input data. And we also have a bit of a modified version of the loss, where we calculate both the loss of the latent variable and the loss of the initial input. So when we applied it on our data, we checked the loss curves of the latent space as well. And we found that even though these losses here are not an exact one-to-one loss with the that we saw earlier, we do see that the training goes on for longer and it can go faster. And we are able to generate distributions that have comparable, if not better, losses to just the simple attention neural processes that we discussed earlier. So when we look at these latent spaces, we can actually study the quasars, the distributions of the quasars. Over here is a distribution of the latent variable for one of the clusters we saw in the LSST AGN data set. And though here it's Gaussian, this is just a distribution of all of them. In a few earlier studies, there were attempts to look at this latent space or other hidden layers in other networks to see if we could find some sort of correlation with physical properties like those we had looked at before, like the mass of the supermassive black hole or the redshift of the quasar or other such properties. And it was found to have high degrees of correlation. So we are now investigating our latent spaces in order to find some sort of hidden information within our quasars. So now equipped with all of these, we hope to we have a very nice pipeline, which I will review now to conclude. So we have our initial data set of light curves. These light curves could come from any sort of large survey with a good sample of light curves that have been sampled over at least 100 or so observations. Then we put them into our, first after pre-processing them and cleaning them, we put them into our clustering module where we use our SOM to generate these clusters. Then we can analyze these clusters and look at if there's some sort of hidden information, as we saw earlier. Then we can take these clusters and train them with different models in parallel. We can look at these models, look at their latent spaces, and look at their different distributions and see if there's some sort of underlying phenomena there. But then finally, you can also take the generated models and do different analyses on them. You can check their structure functions from now these homogeneous smooth cadences to see if you can find the underlying source of the variability. You can look for here hidden periodicities, specifically for looking for emerging supermassive binary black holes. You can look at the TikTok signals that we were discussing earlier and see if they encode some sort of information about them. You can actually classify your light curves and see if there's some sort of new phenomenon that you're looking at, and you can study much more physical processes associated with these light curves. So I'd encourage you to check out the GitHub and try pip installing it. So whatever we were talking about before, we have made no sort of parametric estimations of these light curves. So QNPy is very well adapted for working with many different data sets. We've used it on light curves from quasars, but we've also seen applications in medical data or any sort of time series data. So we'd hope that you'd look at it and play around with it and see if it can suit your need in working at any sort of time series. So thank you for listening to the talk, and I'm open.
Thank you, Aman. Impressive work. So Aman is a master's student at the University of Belgrade. Please check the GitHub. If you have any questions, you can always contact him. Thank you so much for your talk.